there, and welcome to another edition of the 1% Better podcast with your host, Rob O'Donoghue.
Hello there, folks. Welcome back to another episode of the podcast, another installment, and I'm delighted to be putting this one out there. If you're new to the show, thanks so much. You may have checked out Josh Quigley's episode last week, and if you have, I hope you enjoyed it. To be honest, it was the one that has been the most responded to of all the episodes I've released, season 1 and so far in season 2, into something ridiculous like 20,000 views of some of the posts. That doesn't obviously translate directly into listenership, but even a small percentage of that have checked it out, and that's brilliant. It really, really is. I'm so thankful to Josh for taking the time. I know he's gone travelling now and continuing his own journey. We've been in touch, and hopefully we'll get back in touch when he comes back and maybe do something as a follow-up. But I think what's stuck out for me is the fact that this topic of mental health, depression, suicide really is something that is so pervasive right now. And I suppose a lot of people that have reached out are saying thanks for doing it, but there's not enough talking about that in a strange way. I don't know if it was just me, and having my own views of it, and having, not in any way gone through the same stuff Josh has had, but maybe sometimes you go through, you think other people have talked about it or are open about it, but I think not. I think it's definitely still very much under the covers, very much concealed, and people are afraid to open up and share and talk about it. And hopefully that certainly gets easier for people over the next number of weeks, months, years, with this positive movement in that space. And geez, if one or two people got something out of the episode last week, that is an absolute result, and I hope that has been the case. So all I can say is thanks to everybody for the feedback. I've made some really good connections already, talked to a good few people, and have a few new guests coming up over the next while. I'm not going to dedicate every podcast in the future to this topic, but it's certainly one that I'm going to explore further and try and dig deeper into it, knowing that there's a listenership that want to hear stories around this, to know that they're not the only ones, and that's certainly not the case. I've already recorded an episode with Jim Breen, and Jim had set up a Cycle Against Suicide a couple of years ago in Ireland. He's had his own story around depression and mental health, so that's a really powerful episode that'll be releasing in a few weeks. I also talked to a lecturer in UCC who's a psychotherapist, and we talk about psychobiotics. I think that's the right term. His name is Ted Dinan. We talk about how that type of food can help with your mood, and that was really insightful as well. So there are just a couple of other ones coming in the future around this space, and as I said, a few new connections made with some other stories that I'm going to put down, record and put out in the next while. So if you have checked out the Josh episode, thank you. If you haven't, go back and have a listen to it. It's been a big one for the show, and I am more than thankful to Josh for his time on it. Alright, so personally, just a little note, I have hit the 100-day mark for dry 18. That's 100 days without touching a drop of alcohol, which is quite an achievement, I must say, for myself. Certainly something I'm proud of so far, and I've actually put together kind of a blog I've been building over the last 100 days or so around it, and we'll publish that over the next few days, just in case you want to read it and have a insight into 7 or 8 things that I've learned. I think I've landed on 7. Could have been more, but 7 was a nice number, so we'll go with that. So I'll put that out, and yeah, some good stuff going on there. Okay, so on to this week's episode, switching focus. This one is more around the areas of management, leadership, coaching, core values, all things that are very interesting in their own right. And it is with Sarah Abbott. So I worked with Sarah during her time as she led HR for EMEA at EMC and then Dell EMC. And I was really delighted to get her onto the show. Last year, she set up her own venture with her co-founder, Susan Manning, called The People Practice, and that's thepeoplepracticegroup.com, an all-around professional development, coaching, leadership. This one is a two-parter. It's 90 minutes long when we recorded, And there was so much really interesting areas that we went into. We kind of broke it up into 4 or 5 sections. And when I was editing it, I realised there's no way I'm going to put this out all at once, because people might just take a break halfway through and not come back to it. And there's too many good stuff and too many good pieces in here to let that happen. So I broke it up into 2. Part 1 out now. This is it. We talk about her experience and lessons learned from her early career in Ernst & Young, and then on to Apple, talking about value-based learning, principles, self-awareness, failing fast and learning. Part 2 next week will come out with a focus on strategy, management, millennials, leadership. Is it born versus bred? Really good stuff there. A lot of conversation. I'm fascinated by this whole area. Sarah has years of experience in it and has a lot of really good insights and stories to tell. Lots of book recommendations too. So I'm excited to release these over the next couple of weeks. Before I let you get into it, just in case you're in Cork, Sarah and Susan will be hosting a Disrupt HR event on the 17th of April at St. Peter's Church, North Main Street. I'm going to go. I'm not sponsored by this or anything like that. It's just an area I want to delve into a little bit more myself. Hopefully meet some of the speakers on the night. Just said I'd put it there, and it's going to be in the links in the show notes like everything else is that I generally ramble on about. So just before I give you over to Sarah, thanks so much for your following. Thanks so much for your feedback. Continue to do that. I'm all over the social networks at Rob of the Green, so I'd love if you followed, left a comment, suggested a guest, gave me some other stuff going on. I can't believe these intros go on so long. I just have a lot to talk about. I shall leave it there. Subscribe on iTunes, on Spreaker, go to the website. Enjoy the show with Sarah Abbott, and I will talk to you again next week. Take care. Good luck. Welcome to the studio, Sarah.
Thank you, Rob. It's great to be here.
I had the pleasure working with you over the last few years in EMC slash Dell. I know your career prior to that was in Apple. I think you had also worked in Ernst & Young, doing my bit of research. It would probably be safe to say that your experience during the number of years has been heavily in HR, coaching, leadership, strategy, personal development, just to name a few. Is there any other areas there that stick out for you as your career evolved that you'd like to mention?
I think you've probably covered it all, right? I suppose my focus has always been around people and that intrigue around how people operate and, both the good and not so good, right? How are great leaders born or developed, or what happens when you have someone great and their potential is never realised? Mm-hmm. And what did the organisation, how did the organisation impact that, or how did other people impact that, or how did the person themselves impact that?
Right.
I've always been intrigued by that.
You've probably hit about 3 of the questions I have on my leadership question list there, so that's good to know that we're kind of on the same page with that. Question I started to ask the last couple of guests, different flavour of it. What's your earliest memory? I'm putting you on the spot. What comes into your mind when you think of the first thing that you can remember?
I think the first thing I can remember is my grandfather. Mm-hmm. If I go way back, I actually don't know if I've made this up in my head because he died when I was 4. Mm-hmm. But I have memory of him. I can see him sitting on a horse. Okay. So he used to actually ride a horse anywhere he went. Okay. I spent a lot of time with him, seemingly. So that's my first memory. Is he lived in the same house as us? Mm-hmm. So there were 3 generations in our house. Okay. So that's my first abiding memory. You
mentioned your granddad. My granddad, he worked in the bog, Bordnamona.
Okay.
And he worked hard. He used to work crazy hours cycling out to the bog, or even driving a little Honda 50. I remember that. And I would say his kind of work ethic, I would always say that's one of the areas where I got that value. Some of the other ones I can't ever figure out where I got, but it's interesting. There's kind of a parallel there. So in your early years then, Sarah, when you were growing up, I can't imagine, or maybe was leadership and human development always kind of something there? When did that sort of come to fruition?
It's quite interesting. So I grew up a long time ago in a very small farm in West Cork, right? But if you look at it, my nearest neighbours were German, my next nearest neighbours were Dutch, and my third nearest neighbours were English. Right. So we talk about Ireland being very multicultural now. Yeah. Even back then, right? Yeah. It was nothing for us to have, a very diverse neighbours,
right,
close to me. And the other thing that's quite intriguing that actually took me a long time to realise was I worked in the local shop, which was a really small shop. But actually, it was a lady who ran that shop. She was a widow.
Right.
And then when I went to my summer job, it was also a lady who ran that business. And she had 3 small kids and was separated from her husband.
Okay.
And so they were actually my first female role models.
Right.
And both my mother and grandmother were very independent people. So I had a lot of great female role models who were strong, who ran businesses, who nothing was a barrier to. So I think that's quite interesting because we talk a lot today about female diversity, and this is, a lot of years ago. And most of the people in my local community that were leaders were actually female.
Right.
So I do think I learned a lot from those people. I worked in a craft shop during the summer.
Right.
And that woman taught me more about business than probably any business course.
Okay.
Because how she thought about our products, how she dealt with her customers, I was 14 years of age. What a great education, because she shared everything.
And do you think when you were learning that, was that kind of almost subconsciously going in? And do you think even, did she have a set of management principles that she was explicit about, or was she like naturally passing these on, do you think? She
was naturally passing those on, and I think, Steve Jobs says you can only connect the dots when you look back at them.
Yeah.
But I think it's quite interesting because I would have, in HR, it's often the focus is people, but I would have a huge focus on the bottom line.
Okay.
And so often people would hear me say, well, what's the bottom line impact here? How is this actually going to help the business? And if it's not, we shouldn't do it.
Right.
And I think I got that from her.
Okay.
Because everything she did, even if I would come up with ideas, and I often would, and she would say, so how's that going to help my business really? It's a nice thing to do, and you might enjoy doing that, but why would we do that?
Yeah.
And I think that's where I got that from. It's just something innate in me now.
Yeah.
But I think that's where it started.
So like it's an entrepreneur mindset really that you took from her that you apply to previous roles in the corporate environment, which maybe not a lot of people sometimes do because they may have not had that entrepreneurial exposure.
True. Yes, I think so. And I think I worked in a small company as well at one stage where you saw everything: marketing, payroll, everything, right? And I think that does give you a different view, because if you're in a large corporation, you can get lost in your field, or in the busyness of every day, or in best practice, right? Which I think is probably one of the worst things that's ever happened to the corporate world. Best practice is just such a disaster. Right. Thinking about best practice, because I really think it's actually what's best for your context, and what difference does that make? And HR is actually a great field for coming up with new trends, and running with them to try and make a difference. If you track some of those trends all the way through to like the person on the ground who's trying to achieve a sale or build a product or design something new, what difference does that really make? And that whole debate that's going on at the moment about performance reviews is kind of an interesting one, because I think a lot of those actually don't make a difference.
Right.
So I really believe if you have a great HR product as such, and I think you should always think about HR programs and policies in that way.
Right.
You should be able to track it all the way through to how this would make a difference, even if it's in an ideal world. But if you can't track it all the way through, then really, what is it doing? And how do you know what it's doing?
Very interesting, I guess. So when you mention the HR product versus, would it be in that's a product mindset, right? Where do you think you're getting that view of that? Is that again going back to those days? Is it going maybe back to your Apple days?
It's going to my Apple days, right? Apple is a product company, right? And we would think and talk a lot about products, and Steve Jobs would make some really interesting points about, why would anyone pick something off the shelf? And the interesting thing about that company is that whatever they think is core runs all the way through the company. So it's not just for the product department. If it's a product company, then that mindset runs into places like HR.
Right.
And the question you would ask is, if you came up with a new program or a new policy, is why would anyone pick that off the shelf? because it's not because HR told them to, or
Right.
HR is going to police it, but actually if I put it on that shelf, what business leader would pick it off the shelf? And I think that's a great discipline for HR to go through, because, you know, I've done it. You get lost in the excitement of how wonderful this might make people feel. And for me, certainly my sense of wanting to help make things better. And I can get lost in the idea, or I get lost in the core of the idea and add on about 30 things, right? So it becomes something totally different. But if you have to sit back and go, okay, now we have that solution, who would pick it off the shelf? If you told them nothing, who would pick it off the shelf? Because if you have the solution that a leader would pick off the shelf, then you know you're onto something, that you're doing something right. And I've seen actually that happen where we were working on something at one stage, and we had an idea about how that might work. And I went on holiday. And part of the solution was in my office, so there was some physical elements to it.
Okay.
And when I came back, they were all gone.
Right.
And I said to someone in the team, I said, "Where's all the stuff?" And she said, "Oh, people kept coming and taking it." So
The actual solution.
the solution.
The product.
So that's
stuff,
when you knew, hold on a second, people are using this. And then we were intrigued about, well, what are they using it for and why are they using it? But that to me is an example of, okay, then that must be useful for something. So that product design set and design thinking principles, I still use today.
So they were like across the board in Apple being used no matter what area you were working in.
Yes.
You're using similar type principles. And I think the one thing that comes into my mind is that idea of creating something the customer wants they don't really know they want yet. And it was that part of that mindset as well?
Yes, that was part of that mindset. And I have, now in my business, the quote that we live by is Einstein's quote, you know, if you have an hour to solve the problem, 55 minutes should be on what's the question, right? Okay. And I think that became really important. So often what we do is we try and design solutions in HR, and then we give them to the business, okay? But actually we never talked about what the question was.
Right.
So often we'll say, here is something you need to implement. But we've never actually sat down and discussed, is this a question that's really important right now? So often what I will talk about and think about is, what's the real question here?
Right.
And then I might have a hypothesis as to what that is.
Okay. And
then I'll go to the people that matter. So whoever that customer is, it could be your business leaders, it could be a company, and say, so here's what I heard. And it's almost like true coaching skills.
Yeah.
Here's me reflecting back what I heard. Now, what I heard is an interesting concept, because heard might be something someone said, what the data told me, some actions I saw. Also, it might be what's missing, what I didn't see, what words I didn't hear people to say that I was expecting them to say.
Right.
Tim Cook would often talk about the secret sauces in the white space. What happens in the white space?
Yeah.
The pieces that are left behind.
Yeah.
And I would often bring all of that together and say, here's what I heard.
Okay.
So it's almost like a CSI type approch, right? Just keep digging. And then the first thing I would do is check, did I hear this correctly, or am I telling myself a story? So I would get people to either amend what I have or add to it or edit it.
Right.
So that then we can all agree, actually, this is our true context right now.
Okay.
And then when you put that up there for people to reflect on, all of a sudden you see people drawing connections that they never drew before. Just by putting data on a wall sometimes. Yeah. All the data you have. Because actually most of the stuff we need, we have. And people will go, oh my gosh, I didn't realize that. Now it's really obvious to me what we need to do. Okay. Right? And then once you determine that with people, right, now what you've done is you've agreed what's the real question that needs to be answered. Right. And you've actually influenced on the question. There's no need to influence on the solution then. Because everybody's already agreed this question needs to be answered, and it needs to be answered now. Or it doesn't need to be answered, and we park it. Right.
Yeah. What I'm kind of getting again out of that is that sometimes people are too keen to just dive in to try and solve something they don't want to. But in the corporate world, maybe there's that's a pervasive problem, that get busy doing something rather than maybe taking some time to really understand what the problem is. So that's I guess, the crux of what that's about, right?
Yes. And I think, by nature, actually, naturally to me, I'm a solutions person.
Right.
So I actually have to manage that very carefully and go, hold on, pause a second. What question are you trying to answer? And who said that was important? Who really cares?
Yeah.
And who really cares right now? Because sometimes, Steve Jobs would have said there is no such thing as a bad product. There's only bad timing. Okay. So sometimes it's a timing thing. There might be something to solve, but is now the right time to solve it? Or is there something bigger and better? And often and I've seen great examples of, I remember taking one leadership team through this process. It isn't a long process and it isn't a laborious process. But actually, there was a solution that needed to be implemented that I had seen implemented in other companies. Okay. And it had kind of, been a struggle. And this got so much momentum.
Right.
And I remember it was kind of some extra hoops that they would have to go through. But I also remember a leader thinking, I'll go around it. And another leader phoned them to say, you can't do that.
Right.
So HR didn't have to be the policeman because the business really owned it. And HR's role in that was to enable the conversation, not to actually design the solution. Yeah. So, I think that's another important element is be clear in your role in something, right? If you're a consultative part of the business, then consult with the business, but don't do the business's job. It's almost like, some of the principles of coaching. Mm-hmm. Let people think. Mm-hmm. And often the answer is within themselves. And all you really have to do is help them reflect, first of all, on what that context is and let them do their thinking. Nancy Klein, who wrote Time to Think. Yep. What a great book. Oh, excellent. Yeah. Yes, it is. But what a great book, because she talks about that, she talks about that respectful listening. Yeah. And letting people think. And we're so terrible with silence, right? I'm terrible with silence. You can hear, I'm quite a talker, right?
I'm actively listening here, so it's all good. I'm coaching mode. But no, that's really cool. I think there's that sense, and I know when I'm coaching sometimes, by not talking in the early stages of doing it, I'm feeling like, shit, am I doing something here? Is this person thinking I'm a fraud? When they're just doing the talking. But you get used to that. But even in a work environment, if you're the leader, and we'll talk about leadership, you go in and the perception maybe from your team is that this person should be leading and driving us forward, and why are we doing all the talking? So it's kind of that dynamic, and that's uncomfortable, I guess, sometimes, isn't it?
It's very uncomfortable, and actually it was really interesting. I worked in one HR team who did a really great job of enabling the business. But it was interesting because there was a piece of feedback actually that came back at the end of 1 year which said, HR really didn't do anything this year. Okay. And I remember my boss sitting with me thinking, what do we do with that piece of information, And we thought about it. We were a bit concerned in the beginning about, oh gosh, do we have a branding issue? Do we have a relevance issue? And actually what we realised is we had done an awful lot. Yeah. The business had done the implementation. So their traditional view of what to expect from HR was, well, they didn't give us anything. Actually, we gave them what they needed to do what they needed to do. Yeah. And so I think that expectation is there, to your point, that the leader needs to lead. But the best leaders are the ones, if you walk into a room and you can't actually tell who the leader is. Mm-hmm. They're the person who's leading from behind, not from in front. Yeah. No, it's cool. It's definitely interesting. I always think the analogy to a referee in a match as well, sometimes when they're there, but the best referees are the ones you never hear from or see or are never involved in any of the controversy during the game. So referees are, I suppose, leaders in their own little way as well. Managers maybe as well. Cool. We're going in great tangents here, which is perfect. I did want to just maybe take it back. So you're forming some of those values and principles yourself when you were exposed to the craft shop, but then did you start? What was your kind of view or focus or vision for yourself around them? Were you starting to think, I have a passion about entrepreneurship and people, I want to go into a HR route, or was it less exciting? That was never my thought.
Okay.
So I think the areas that I was drawn to when I was so for me, school was about learning new things and my social scene. Okay. It really was, right?
Were you a messer?
Yes, I was quite disruptive. Okay. But at the same time, I didn't have to study the hardest. So my sister had to study really hard, right?
Okay.
And I didn't. So I could get away with a lot more from that perspective. But my whole thing was a sense of enjoyment, right? So wherever I, got enjoyment, that's where I went. So, I did a lot of plays when I was in school. I debated. I actually, when I was in secondary school, I debated in UCC, in the university. So I loved that side of things. And I was always kind of leading something. I didn't know that's what it was. I wasn't exposed to that. But I was always kind of leading a group in something, right? With something or other. So, and I really didn't know what I wanted to do, except the world was my oyster. Yeah. And my mother had kind of instilled this belief in me that I could, if I wanted to go to NASA, then go to NASA.
Cool.
I don't know that actually I was that bright, but she led me to believe, well, the world is your oyster, do what you want. Yeah. So I wasn't sure what I wanted to do. I had a great love. I learned French, and I had a great love of speaking French. Right. So initially, I wanted to travel and be a linguist. Okay. So that was my first route. So I kind of started that studying French after secondary school to be a linguist in the European Union. As it was a time in Brussels. Mm-hmm. But in between that, I actually got a good permanent pensionable job in the bank. Right. Actually, that was a big deal at the time to get one of those jobs.
It sounds lefty brain to your righty brain world.
Yes. So everybody was thrilled and they were congratulating my mother and all this sort of thing. It was a huge deal. And then I said to my mother, I don't think I want to do this. Yeah. And my mother did the greatest thing ever. And she said, that's okay. You follow whatever you think is right and it will be fine. Cool. And I actually did go to the bank then. Okay. So it was kind of reverse psychology. I think she was being quite clever.
I think she was doing it on purpose.
So I did that. I travelled. That brought me to London. I spent time there. So I got a lot from that. But that path didn't move as fast as I wanted it to move. And I got great advice from one of the leaders there who said, if you want to move faster, it's not going to happen for you here. Mm-hmm. You need to figure out, or else figure out how you stay here and be comfortable with that. Yeah. So that's when I moved to Ernst & Young. Okay. And I worked for a wonderful lady there. So I happened to end up in HR as an administrator. Okay. Just
from the bank to...
Yes, purely by chance. Okay. Right. And she was brilliant because she would explain everything to me, right? So even though I was the administrator, she would sit me down and say, here's why we're doing this and here's what's intriguing about this. So she instilled that interest in that whole piece. And it was really interesting to see projects that worked well and projects that were supposed to be brilliant and that failed, and everything in between. So that's kind of what gave me the bit between my teeth around HR from that perspective. And I kind of ended up in a management role there. Actually, I ended up in a weird management role because I had a HR team, but I also had all the IT programmers for the HR systems, which was an unusual mix. And that's where I got my first interest in. I didn't really do a great job of leading those teams. Right. Apologies to them. But that's what made me think, how can I get better at this? And God, this isn't quite simple.
Yeah. It sounds like, though, you didn't have any fear of failure or fear of trying new things from that perspective. This kind of fail repeatedly to get better and better and learn. Were you
I'm okay with that.
Experimenting and okay with that.
Even now, I'm okay with that. Yeah. I don't mind failing. I don't mind making a fool of myself. Well, I do it often, so I'm used to it. Yeah. But I don't mind doing that. And I think you learn loads about yourself and the only, I don't beat myself up, right? I kind of chill about it because for me, the only time I beat myself up is if I haven't done right by myself, i.e. I didn't try hard enough. That's a real bugbear for me. Or I didn't do right by someone else, if I was mean to someone. Okay. They're the two things that really stress me out and make me feel really bad about myself. Okay. But outside of that, I would much prefer to try something. Yeah. And my mantra would often be, so what have we got to lose? As long as it's not life or death. Yeah. I'm pretty much okay with it. And I have the same with my son, right? If he says, I'm going to do X, I'm like, yep, off you go. As long as there's no life or death situation here, I'm going to let you try that.
Were those mantras ones you were kind of consciously using even in those early days, or were you...
I don't think I consciously used them. I was definitely fearless. I would do odd things, right?
Give me an example.
Well, so in my very early days, the first time I flew to London, the very first time I'd flown outside the country, I went to London to visit someone.
Okay.
I was staying with a friend, but they were at work during the day, and I did all my London tour. So they came home the first day, and they said to me, "So, how was your day?" And I said, "Great. I went shopping in this place, and I did this." And they were like, "How did you get there?" And I said, "Well, I went on the tube." And they were like, "How did you figure out the tubes?" And he was like, "Well, you just look at the map."
Yeah.
And the person nearly had a heart attack saying, "Oh my God, you're not old enough to do, like, you can't go off in London and do things like this." And I was like, "Well, of course you can. I'm a bit sensible. I'm, not going to put myself in dangerous situations. It's not the end of the world if I get lost." So I never had, that sense of, thinking about, what will happen? I can't do this because X, Y, and Z might happen. They might happen, but they might not.
But there was no permissions either. You weren't looking for permission, and just from what you were saying about growing up and what your mum was giving you that freedom to make those decisions, that's really a really nice approach, because you talk to people that are afraid of doing things, and you can see from their trajectory of growing up that it might have been something that held them back in earlier days, or had been given the wrong direction maybe.
Yes. So I think as I got older, maybe I did get more risk adverse, and I've probably come full circle and not as risk adverse now. And sometimes maybe I did fail, but I'm a real kind of, growing up on a farm, right? My parents would say you have to get on with it, right?
Yeah.
So maybe I did fail, but I didn't realise it because I made the best of that context anyway.
Sure.
Right?
And would you have had any processes or reflections on what worked, what didn't, and how you would make it better the next time round, or was that again just naturally happening? No,
I would always kind of learn from things, and say, "Oh, what did I do there, and how did I get myself into this, and what brought us to this point?" And there were times when I learned a lot about myself from that, I know I am most energized when you give me a challenge. Like if you say to me, "Rob, Sarah, we need to paint this room," and nobody else could paint it. Right? So if I think there's a challenge that nobody else could solve, I'm there. I remember doing this when I first went to Ernst & Young. My boss went on holidays, and I didn't have a huge amount of work to do while she was away. So I decided the filing room, this is back in the day when you didn't have computers really, contained all the HR files for 7,000 people.
Yeah.
And it hadn't been touched, I'd say probably in 20 years. And I decided to tidy it. Now it was a room that had no window, right? And I spent a week in there. But it was interesting because for me, I was like, this is a huge job, and I can make this pristine. We'll be able to find everything, right? And everybody thought it was, they couldn't believe, and they were like, "Why would you have decided to do that?"
Yeah.
But for me, that was something, if you give me something that probably anybody can do, I'm not as energized.
Right.
And that's important because I have to manage that, right? And also, if you give me a challenge that's really challenging, I'll get so energized about it, everything else will pale into insignificance.
Right.
So I have to manage that to make sure that, I say hello to my family if I'm in the middle of a cool project. I have to actually sit down every week now and go through my diary and say, okay, what was the ratio here?
Right.
What did you get lost in? What did you not get lost in? And some people don't have to do that because it comes naturally to them. For me, it doesn't come naturally.
All right.
And that's one of the things that I was seeing. I would get lost in projects to the point, they would just take over.
Do you think as you were working in that HR admin role and you were becoming a manager, was HR and people becoming a passion, or did you realize it was a passion, or how did that continually evolve? Because obviously now with coaching and very much focused on people and development, where did they start to connect?
I think what my passion was in was work and achieving goals,
right,
and action and thinking and creating new ways of doing things. I think that was really my passion and what gave me energy.
Okay.
I don't think I had thought really about which field I really wanted to apply that in. I never saw work as work.
Right.
To me, anything I ever did, I enjoyed every day.
Right.
And and because I was able to do that, I always felt if I didn't enjoy it, I would change, which I did a good few times. It was only when I got to, I think my time in Musgraves was really interesting because we did a lot of cool projects there in HR. That probably started the seeds of going down that route, which is a bit late, I suppose. And then in Apple, where we did some wonderful projects around people and how we thought about people and and that wasn't easy at times to figure out some of those challenges. That was where I really figured out how you could actually have an environment that really set a new standard for how people experienced work.
Okay.
And how you could almost bring the whole person to bear.
I think that brings it into that area. So I'd love to maybe go a little bit deeper into that. I know you've done a lot of research into the whole person and leadership, and maybe talk a bit about what work you did even in Apple there, or skills that developed as you would look at those projects around getting the immersed person involved.
Yes, I suppose the first thing was there was a really insightful head of HR called Dan Walker, who actually had a very different view of HR.
Right.
So he had no love of HR programs and policies. He just didn't get that connection. And his view was, for goodness sake, can you really think about what's going on here, and let's get real about what are we trying to do? We're trying to deliver to a business, and we want people who will enjoy what they're doing so they can do their best work. And we retain them, right? So it was quite simple from that perspective. So everything kind of hooked around that. And he really wanted HR to be relevant, or else not exist, you know? So that was one piece. It was that whole focus around, we're going to change how things are done around here. And this was in the late 90s, so it was kind of a very different time. So he was somebody who asked hard questions.
Right.
And I sat on, he came to Cork at one stage. He was based in obviously Cupertino, and he came to Cork, and I had some questions about how we did things, and he said, okay, you come to the States. You come, sit in this project team. I want to hear what you have to say. So his view is hierarchy meant nothing to him. It was like, pick the people that he could mold into a team, and we did some really interesting work about what other companies were doing. And even sitting in meetings where Tim Cook was present, and the type of questions he would ask, you would prepare for a presentation, and then Tim would be silent for a long time, and then he would just ask that one killer question, which was going right back to the core of what you were trying to do, and you were kind of go, darn, I got lost in the work, in the business of this.
Yeah.
I forgot what was true here. And it's the same of product design. If you ever hear Johnny Ives talk about a particular product, he talks about the really, really core aspects of a product.
Yeah.
So it was the same with those. And we did a lot of work around, leadership development, how we hired our leaders. When I worked in Apple Retail in Europe, people would say, what's the secret sauce? Or we didn't have big leadership development programs. Right? But we did teach people the core aspects of the values.
Okay.
And so it was a values-based system where the values, these people were dispersed all over Europe, right? And in this day and age, right, it's a bit like, product implementation. How long does it take a product to get mass market?
Yeah.
That period is much shorter now than it ever was if you go back 30 years, right? It's the same with leadership development. The ability to acquire skills and knowledge about leadership now is 10 a penny, right? And a lot of the programs that are out there that are even free, they're great. Yeah. Just go do them. But that's not what makes a great leader. Right. It's what you do with that information and how well you know yourself. Okay. And it's those aspects. So I remember once somebody saying in one of the companies I worked with, we had some new leaders come into the business, and we had our existing leaders share their experiences with them. And it was literally conversation around, just share your experience. There was no choreograph. We didn't tell anybody what they were to say, so it was up to them, what they said. And one guy sat there and he said, since I came to work at this company, I'm a better husband and father. And I think that's a pretty cool statement if your employees are saying that. Yeah. That you've made them a better person. Yeah. And that was all down to how we took people through this journey of self-awareness. Good and bad. Okay. Right?
So there was a lot of EQ type stuff going on in the processes that were, and process is probably a bad word, but the journey then. So what made that guy a better husband and father? What were the he probably had a set of leadership principles that he had already that were standard, but what were the tactics or techniques to make him better?
The tactics and techniques, one of them was reflection, self-reflection. Do you know yourself? And how well do you know yourself? And what's the story you're telling yourself? And how do you prove that to be accurate, right? That was the first piece. And
even on that one, on each one, maybe just like a little bit of like how did that be implemented?
Okay.
Was it like you're to spend 30 minutes every week sitting in a room, reflecting, or is it just ongoing kind of encouraging, creating groups of people talking to each other, just interested?
So it was much more about talking with others and then reflecting on who you are and what that means.
Okay.
Right? So we had one leadership class, and all it was a series of, there was probably 60 slides, and each slide just had one sentence.
Right.
And it was then going through what that really means here.
Right.
And having that discussion about what that means here.
Okay.
And often what leaders would say to me is, I have to really unlearn some things. And these are people who are very successful and who in their previous careers, very successful, and they had to unlearn some of those.
Right.
So some of that was about taking that away. And what we would do is follow up.
Right.
So anything we did, it had to live. So if we trained people on anything, so one of the things was how to give and receive feedback. Both were, we felt, important. And we would follow up on that, right? So first of all, HR would work with the leaders afterwards and debrief them and talk about, how did this feel for you and what were your learnings, etc. That was an important piece. And secondly, we would also help them with reflection. So for instance, and it was really simple things, right? Yeah. So we had a learning log.
Right.
Okay.
Yeah.
So
it's like a journal almost.
Yeah. So basically, as you had your one-on-one with your boss once a quarter or whatever it was, your boss would say to you, "So tell us about that learning experience," and they would ask you. You would have had to have picked one or two key moments that month.
Okay.
What were the moments? What happened?
Right.
What did you learn about yourself? And what are you going to do with that in the future?
Cool.
And I think because we had created, the space and the culture that existed was that this was done by everyone. And it really was an all or nothing model, right? So I think that's one of the secrets. If you're going to train people on something, how often do you hear, right? Yeah, but that won't work now when I go back to my desk, or that won't work in the real world.
Yeah.
Like if it's not a real world training, then don't do it. Because I often wonder, what would happen if we stopped every single leadership development program tomorrow? Would leaders fail? I doubt it.
Yeah.
So doesn't that say something about what we need to do with that? And I was reading McKinsey's this morning talking about that. McKinsey's just wrote an article about why leadership development programs don't work, and I think they were right. Because one of the things I think I've learned over the years is that the development I've seen have the most impact in helping people be the best them has been the free stuff.
Wow. Yeah. That's interesting. That's really cool. Like, do you think there'd be some leaders more naturally open to some of that than others? Kind of like reflection to me is all about taking time out, even touching on the meditation world. Some are all on board on that, others are pushing away from that. Like, how did you get those that were not naturally agreeable to that to come along? Is it measurement and you have to measure the levels at which they're engaged, or is it?
So I think reflection is different and very personal, and I think that's one of the things about leadership development, right? We're trying to make people into the perfect leaders. I think that's not the right way to think about it. I think you need to think about it, how can we make you the best you, if you want to be that. Okay, that's the first thing. So one of the big mistakes I made along the way is I used to coach people and mentor people, and sometimes I would get frustrated because some people, what I call the victim mentality, which is, I need someone else to sort this out for me, and the world I'm in is not my fault.
Yeah.
And what I actually realized is not everybody wants to be the best version of themselves, or they can't be at a particular point in time in their life.
Right.
So there's times when just getting by is as much as a person can do.
Yeah.
Okay? And that's actually okay. It took me a long time to figure that out, right? Because my view is you always need to be learning and you always need to be moving forward and continuous improvement. But actually there are times in our lives when, you know what? There's so much going on, just getting by might be okay.
Yeah.
You know? Being there forever, I don't think is a good thing. But for people to answer your question on reflection. So first of all, in the scenario I just outlined, it was part of the culture.
Right.
You couldn't actually be successful in that culture without doing it. But the second thing I would say is, so for years I didn't reflect at all, right? I would think about things, but I wouldn't really reflect on them. And it was only when somebody said to me one day, just try it for 4 weeks. And after 4 weeks, Sarah, you can give it up. Because I was like, yeah, I do it all in my head. It's great, you know, and blah, blah, blah. And it was really interesting. I think by the second time, so my way of reflecting is I write. Okay. I don't type. It doesn't work for me on an iPad for some reason. Yeah. But I write in a notebook. And I write all sorts. I can write 40 pages. Wow. In the space of 20 minutes, right? Yeah. And it could be just everything that's going on. It could be ideas in my head. It could be what, but I will associate, you know, how does that make me feel? What does that tell me for the future? So I will try and do that. It's
quite free form though. It's not structured.
Absolutely free form. But then I have some kind of structured questions at the end. But what's really interesting, and this is where I saw the real value of it, is that when I would read it back, things that I thought to be true, when I read it back, I realised weren't. Yeah. And I would read it and go, that's a very interesting story you're telling yourself. Because when I read this, I see something totally different. Yeah. So that was what made me understand the power of taking what's happening within you, putting it outside yourself. Right? It would probably work if you recorded it as well. Yeah. And then either reading or listening to it back in the third person. Yeah. Because, you know, when somebody, they say, you know, problem shared is problem solved. When somebody comes to you, oftentimes they don't need you to say anything. They just need that third party element. Yep. They need to put it outside of themselves so they can manipulate it and look at it, and the insights are different then when you shape it that way. So often I would say that to people is try it for 4 weeks. Yeah. That's all I'm asking you to do. If you get nothing from it, then maybe it's not for you.
Definitely the 4 weeks. Like there's the 21-day challenge and the 30-day for anything, especially anyone that talks to me about meditation and stuff. Try and do it for 4 weeks. Get it, you'll start seeing the benefits of it. What was interesting when you were talking about the writing, I was doing some reading as well about, like, that's kind of almost like an NLP, you know, you're the observer and reading it back, or when you're writing that stuff down, this concept of sub-personalities as well, that it could be one of the 17 different versions of me that are thinking that, and then when another version reads it back, it was like, that's just craziness or whatever. So yeah, I love that tip that anyone can really do. You don't have to be just a leader, right? So that was one of the things. Just one other, maybe one other technique or tool that was used, because I think there's such learning and good 1% tips that come out of that. Anything else come to mind that was being leveraged for leadership development in those years, or even more recently that comes to mind?
Yeah, I think the other element is your network. There's a book that I read actually that was quite insightful to me, called The Power of Pull. It's by John Hagel and John Seeley Brown.
It's the first book recommendation. So the power, well, we have time to think.
The Power of Pull.
Power of Pull. Okay.
But it's a really interesting book because essentially there's a lot of research in there about, you know, why people become successful in certain ways, and he looks at or they look at surfers, world champion surfers. They look at uprisings in Egypt, so kind of very diverse group of things. Right. But the core of it, right, is quite interesting, because they talk about actually one of the keys to success is putting yourself on the edge, and they talk and actually they created the center for the edge as a result of that. Yeah. And that's where that came from. Putting yourself on the edge of disparate communities, right? So this notion of serendipity, not doing things, because if you do everything with your end goal in mind, you may miss a whole host of stuff. Right. So just putting yourself on the edge of different things, you just don't know what that might bring. And where I find that terribly interesting is, you know, I worked in Musgraves, which was, you know, a big retail distributor, Ernst & Young, which is obviously a very big accountancy firm, then in technology, and now I'm actually doing some work with some pharmas. But it's interesting how you can bring stuff from one to the other, right? Even though they're very, very different. And even acting as a leader, right? One of the great analogies that I think of when I think about leaders is being a farmer, because I came from that background, right?
Yeah.
How a farmer has to manage their resources despite the weather, right? Despite things going wrong, they have to deal with all of this. So they say, the world is much more volatile and ambiguous. But think about being a farmer.
Yeah.
You don't get to control the rain ever, right? And all of that sort of different stuff, right? From that perspective,
comfortable, not in control of everything.
Exactly.
You get that,
So I think being on the edge of various different things, and what I found is, I can be quite goal oriented. So I kind of sometimes have to go, okay, just go to this. You've no idea where you're going there, and you mightn't have that 2 hours. But you never know what you might learn. And I always find that they spark things. And you and I were talking before we started the recording about, guess who I met yesterday, Rob? And then you were saying, actually, this might link to this.
Yeah.
And they're totally different worlds, right? But I just think that's being on the edge of different things. So in those leadership development programs, using your peers was huge. And I think the other element was listening. Creating space to listen. And then self-awareness. Being the key, right? So going back to reflection in some ways, but how do you know yourself, right? I'm not a great, I have mixed feelings, I think, about profiling tools, etc. Except that I do glean stuff from them about myself, and I kind of think, oh, okay, well, that's great that I'm naturally like that. But here's the downside of being like that. So I need to manage that piece. So it's all about light and dark from my perspective, and I think that self-awareness piece. And I think some people say they're very self-aware, but I would say I was probably one of those people. But actually then when I would go to people and say, so here's how I describe myself, and they would laugh and say, that's not you. And I had this conversation recently with someone about a piece of work that we were doing together, and I said, but I don't really want to just do that piece. And the person said, oh, for goodness sake, you come alive when you do that stuff. And I was like, yeah, you're probably right. And I had to accept that, right?
Yeah.
And I was like, but that isn't the coolest work, but I'm good at it. So I was like, okay. So I think if you think you're self-aware, go and ask somebody else, right? That will be true to you and that knows you well enough, right? And go for the challenging person. Don't go for the person who's going to massage your ego. That doesn't really help you. It might make you feel better. And that whole piece of when I was saying, was to train people on accepting feedback, really, really important.
Yeah. Yeah, I've talked to people in the past that are very open to getting 360s and want feedback, and others that completely are, totally against it and shut down to it. Then that's, to me, is something. There's a fear sometimes of being self-aware or fear of getting feedback because of
you might not like what you hear.
Exactly, yeah.
And I think there is a piece of that. So we all have bad parts, unfortunately. And it's kind of almost an acceptance of that, right? We're human.
Yeah.
And I think this world we have now, how about to be the perfect X, Y, and Z, or, you need to get up at 4 a.m., right? I think we need to chill a little bit and go, we're human.
Yeah.
Some days we might be able to get up at 4 a.m. and some days we might need to sleep in. Yeah. And, we need to be good to ourselves, first and foremost. You can't really be great with the world if you don't give yourself a bit of a pass at times, right? If you do it all the time, then you're just, giving up. But I do think you need to do that. Yeah.
And I think I read a quote recently, there's always going to be a struggle. There's probably that mindset of people trying to get there and make it, and then everything is going to be fine. But when you realise that sort of thing doesn't exist, it kind of takes a bit of pressure off you as well, because there's always going to be stuff thrown at you, that you have to deal with, I would think.
I agree, and I think, I see people who, and I coach people, right, who are very successful in quote unquote, but are not very happy. And I do think, what I try and remember, it doesn't always work for me, is do right by myself and do right by others. And then I think there's lots of freedom from having a healthy conscience.
Yeah.
And that's my conscience is, and I know when I trip myself up, right, if I did something too fast, or if I tried to wing it, if you like, I get unhappy. It doesn't come maybe straight away, but if I don't give myself a good run of the day, you'll find me cranky by noon.
Okay.
And then that comes out to everybody else as well, right?
Yeah. Well, that's it. Getting to know yourself and know your routine and knowing what works and what doesn't is crucial, I think. But again, it goes back to being aware, self-aware, because sometimes I'd look back a few years ago and I would remember now certain days or weeks when I'd be in bad form all week long, but I wasn't connecting the dots that maybe it was getting up at 8:30 instead of 8 or 7 or whatever, just things like that. So it's to take the step back and, as you said, journal, maybe log, why am I having a shit day today? What potentially contributed for that? And then maybe stuff might emerge as you kind of scribble it out. So we're touching around leaders. I think at the start you mentioned born versus bred leader. And I know you've done research into leadership in general. Like, what's your view on that? Is there anything? It's probably a very difficult one to answer, but perspective on that? How was that? Did you enjoy it? I hope so. If you did, please like, share, and do all that other good stuff that only takes a second on social media but means an awful lot to me as it spreads the reach. You can get the details from the show in the show notes on the website robofthegreen.ie. In there you can share the show out with others. I really just want to touch on 3 other quick things. 1, feedback. I learned so much from it. Without it, I can't improve. Please give me a bit of feedback, positive, negative, constructive. Would you recommend a book? Do you have any other ideas for guests? How about more video? Let me know what you want and I can make it happen. I will try. That's number 1. Number 2, sharing is caring. This year I'm making more of an effort to try and expand the reach. Facebook, there's a page and there's a group. The 1% Better community on Facebook is where I really hope new listeners go to share ideas, comments, in general things that they could help others with. That's what it's there for. Follow me on Spreaker.com, that's the new host. I'm on Twitter, growing not exponentially at all, but slowly, so please follow there. I'm on Instagram, all of these are at Rob of the Green. LinkedIn, Rob O'Donoghue. Get in touch, would love to hear from you. Number 3 is about support. So I'm offering a few hours a month, pro bono, free coaching to those that can't afford it, that need some coaching, that want some coaching. If you go to the website, the support page, click on the pro bono link. On the flip side of that, where you guys can support me, go to patreon.com, the Rob of the Green page. You can make a donation there. You can get access to exclusive content, which I'm adding all the time. That would be awesome. Anything you contribute will go back into the show to make it better, make it more than 1% better. Also, there's the option to buy one of those books that were recommended through the website, which will bring you to Amazon, which will get you the normal links, which will get you the books at the normal price, but supposedly Amazon will give the show a small donation every time a book is purchased, or anything for that matter, which is great. So finally, I just wanted to say thanks so much for listening. I know it's difficult to make improvements, to push things forward, to get outside your comfort zone. I'm trying to do it all the time. I hope that every listen and every show and every guest that is on gives you something to take away that you could apply, adopt and adapt into your own life to create a new habit, to make something better. Don't overreach. Small improvements, 1% is enough. And thank yourself for making the time to listen to the show. It shows you're interested in learning, improving, and getting better, even if it's just 1% at a time. Have a great day and good luck.